I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is a Fear and Greed extended interview. All the other good bits we couldn't fit into the daily podcast. If you're looking for the daily episode of Fear and Greed, check the podcast playlist. Otherwise, enjoy the interview. With the government's JobKeeper support payments due to end later this month, there's long been talk of a looming fiscal cliff. Part of this discussion is a wave of insolvencies as companies take on the full weight of paying their staff when government help ends. Recently, I spoke to Duncan Hogg from EY about their capital confidence barometer, which indicates confidence within the business community, particularly in relation to mergers and acquisitions. One of the most interesting findings from the study was the belief that there would no longer be quite as many insolvencies as once feared. John Winter is Chief Executive Officer of ARETA, the Australian Restructuring, Insolvency and Turnaround Association. John, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Great to be back again, Sean. Thank you.
Now, when we spoke last year, second half of last year, the economy was in the midst of a recession and there really was widespread belief that the government support packages were delaying many insolvencies. Do you think that's still the case?
Yeah, it's been a really unusual progression of the economic factors around this, Sean. I mean, there's no doubt that when we last caught up, we were seeing the confluence of all of the support initiatives going to come off at the end of September. So it was the end of JobKeeper 1, it was the end of bank support for loans that were in financial distress, and it was the end of the commercial lease supports as well. Now, obviously the government made moves to soften that curve. We were looking at a real insolvency tsunami come October and November, but the softening of those support measures out to JobKeeper 2.0 and also the banks giving more forbearance in the loans certainly has taken a lot of pressure off. One of the other things that was fitting alongside that was the government had a range of anti-insolvency measures, which included a protection against insolvent trading prosecutions and also a protection around what's called statutory demands. And that's where businesses that are seeking payments can serve a legal notice on companies with a view to winding them up if they owe them money. So all of those things were softened out into this year. And we're seeing a really different sort of environment now where the economy has recovered somewhat. But of course, those measures are still keeping a lot of businesses that really should be going through an insolvency process alive in some form or another.
Okay, so just before we get on to what's going to happen in the next couple of months, you mentioned the tenancy relief and the bank freezing loans. Most of that has come off now. Towards the end of last year, I kind of appreciate what you're saying is that rather than it being hit with a big bang, the government extended JobKeeper, but the banks did start asking for their loans to be repaid, which is fair enough, and property guys wanted their tenants to start paying rent again. What happened during that period at the end of last year? Was there a pickup in insolvencies?
No, there really wasn't. So the only thing that we saw was a small spike towards the end of the year, and that was primarily, we believe, because we were seeing the insolvent trading protections coming off. But there wasn't anywhere near the sort of spike coming into Christmas that we thought there might otherwise be. And it's pretty clear in discussions with the Australian Banking Association and others that what the banks are doing in particular is working progressively with borrowers who are in distress to try and find ways to get them rehabilitated. And so what you are seeing is a changed culture within the banking community in that rather than moving straight to an enforcement action, they're trying to find ways to remediate the payments or to lengthen the payment terms and provide some additional protection. But the latest stats from the ABA do continue to show that there is a significant number of borrowers who haven't started repaying their loans and aren't properly engaging with their bank. So I think it's very clear that in that space, there's still a lot of loans that are of great concern. We just aren't seeing the hammer being dropped to force those insolvencies through.
During the earnings season, and the Commonwealth Bank reported, but the other three big ones had their quarterly updates. We're all very excited by the number of loans that had come off being frozen, but presumably the ones that were still frozen, and that's counted in the hundreds of thousands, it may even be in the millions, those loans, presumably they're the ones who are most likely to struggle when things get back to normal, so to speak.
Sean, you've hit the nail on the head. That's exactly the issue. What we have seen is that the ones who could come back online are coming back online, and the tail is the area of genuine distress in the community. And those could be ranging from the industries that we know are in distress, so hospitality, tourism, etc. Those are the sort of industry groups where we're expecting to see those insolvencies start to pick up. And they're the ones who aren't going and paying attention to the loans that are falling due.
John, we'll be back in a moment. My guest today is John Winter, Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Restructuring, Insolvency and Turnaround Association. Okay, so what do you think will happen in the next 3 or 4 months? And keep in mind, of course, that JobKeeper does end.
And that's the big thing, Sean. I think it's abundantly clear to all of us now that the single biggest feature that has kept organisations going through this period is JobKeeper. The fact that we haven't seen the spikes that you were talking about before around the end of the insolvent trading moratorium, the end of the statutory demands moratorium, or even as banks and commercial lease owners have come back and sort of started to put some pressure, we haven't seen this big resurgence of insolvencies. So the one simple conclusion that you can draw from that is that it's JobKeeper that's keeping those distressed businesses alive. So come the end of March, when we're expecting to see JobKeeper completely removed, that's when we do think we're going to see pressure on those firms. There's no doubt that there are plenty of organisations that are being kept alive purely because of JobKeeper. And indeed, when I talk to other industry association CEOs, we're well aware of businesses that have effectively given up their retail tenancy, but they're still alive as a business because they're still paying JobKeeper off to their staff. So they're not actually going to return at the end of this process. They are businesses that are true zombies, but JobKeeper is keeping them technically ticking over.
And are they in the sectors that you mentioned, hospitality, perhaps travel and tourism?
Yeah, look, I think that's the areas of gravest concern. There is no doubt that hospitality has suffered terribly, and certainly the hospitality sectors around, the hospitality businesses around the CBDs. Tourism is a little more complex. We certainly know that a lot of domestic tourism has risen quite dramatically, but the absence of international tourism has caused harm in other particular areas. So it's not an even playing field in tourism, but there's certainly some areas there that we do expect to see some insolvencies start to rise once JobKeeper comes off, because they are benefiting significantly from those JobKeeper payments.
Are there any other areas that you're particularly worried about?
No, I think that's the two main areas of concern. What we are seeing, of course, is stats out last week show that we've got a record level of agricultural produce this year. We're seeing some really healthy signs in other parts of the economy, but it is that sort of broader hospitality and tourism sectors that are causing real concern, Sean.
So if this occurs in the next few months, and there's probably a better than even likelihood that it will occur, that there will be a clean out, for want of a better word, in that sector, how does that evolve? Like I'm trying to get my head around what's the economy look like when these hospitality providers, the coffee shops, the restaurants, maybe some of the smaller tourism operators fold. That must cause great dislocation, certainly for different parts of the country, different geographies.
It does, Sean, and I think what you're getting at there is that it doesn't happen in isolation. These industries are connected to a wide variety of other supply chains and infrastructure. The removal of those businesses is not simply a number that disappears on a screen. There are creditors who will fail to get paid, and that will place stress on those creditor organisations. So the whole supply chain feels the impact when those businesses fold. I don't think we're going to see anything like the sort of tsunami increase. This is going to be a gentle rise. And I should say, Sean, we are still 60% below normal insolvency levels in Australia.
Wow.
It's quite extraordinary. So since April last year, we've been trending at 50 to 60% below normal yearly insolvency rates. So there's no doubt we're going to see a pushback up to the more reasonable levels, and indeed we will go above that over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. But as those businesses fold, you will find that those creditors are going to have to recognise that they're not going to get paid. That will in turn cause them financial distress, and they will need to take remedial measures to try and protect themselves and keep their businesses going into the future as well. And so it's that process, and that's the one where we really hope that businesses, particularly small businesses, are going out and getting the right sort of advice, because dealing with financial distress isn't something that most businesses are used to, and it requires a particular skill set to address it.
We'll be back with more in a minute. I'm talking to John Winter, CEO of Areta. Of course, you're the Restructuring, Insolvency and Turnaround Association. The turnaround part, whenever I've spoken to people within your industry, the turnaround part is their favourite part. Presumably, there'll be lots of companies that if they go and get the right advice, as you just suggested, they will be able to get through.
Yeah, Sean, and I think this is one of the great misnomers out there. Nobody ever enjoys shutting down a business. It's a gut-wrenching process, and that includes for the liquidators that are called in to do that work. And all too often, there's just nothing left to save. So if you do get the right advice early on, there is actually an opportunity to turn your business around. But if you're more broke than broke, you can't do that. You've got to have something left to be able to save. But registered liquidators are the best qualified turnaround practitioners in the market. So if you talk to an expert early on, there are important steps that you can take to save your business. And indeed, at the beginning of the year, the government brought in a new regime called the Small Business Restructuring process, and that does allow businesses with less than $1 million in debt to go through a protected turnaround process. So if you are a small business and you think there is a chance to rehabilitate your business by pushing down some of your debts, this new process, which can only be done by liquidators, does give you a significant lifeline. So there are some real opportunities there for businesses that might be listening to this right now to think about what their options are and to possibly find a way through all this.
That highlights that getting help isn't just something for medium and large size businesses, it's something for all businesses, small included.
Yeah, that's right, Sean. And look, the insolvency and restructuring regime in Australia is punishingly complex. We have one of the most complex arrangements in the world. And unsurprisingly, most people in business know very little about them. The only time they generally come across them is if one of their clients goes broke and they have to muddle their way through it. So the idea of trying to navigate one of these processes on your own is frankly nightmarish, and you shouldn't do it because it is too complex and you need to go to experts. But it's just important to know that there is help out there and there are ways through. And so rather than sort of not opening the letter that's coming from the bank when you're not paying your loan or ignoring putting in your tax returns for your business, those are things you should stop doing and you should start getting some advice pretty quickly.
I remember last time you were on, the piece of advice which I remember so clearly is don't put your head in the sand. Open the letters, open the emails, get in touch, because you said most people that really eventually come a cropper are those who actually don't pay attention to what's going on beforehand.
And that's exactly right, Sean. All too often we see people who've stopped looking after their books and records or stopped engaging with the people they owe money to, including the ATO or their banks. And those are the ones where there's just nothing left to save. So, it is that moment of self-realisation. It is the acceptance that your business is in trouble and you do need some help. And once you go down that pathway, there can be a way through. But if you keep ignoring it, then unfortunately you and your business are doomed financially.
This is actually an honest confession. After that interview with you last year, I went and did my tax return because I thought I just hadn't looked at it and I had ignored it. And in the end, I got money back. So there you go. But it was actually that piece of advice. Just before you go, you mentioned the small business code that that came at the beginning of the year. How do you think that the government has handled the regulatory environment for companies who are struggling?
Look, the government brought these measures in, unfortunately, all too quickly and didn't consult properly on them. So there's a lot of problems with the regime that's been brought in. Now, it was an idea that originally came from Areta and was supported by the Productivity Commission, but the execution has left something to be desired. So the government, throughout the course of the pandemic, has thrown a lot of emergency measures in. And unfortunately, they've kind of taken an 80-20 rule to it. They've said that if this works in 80% of the cases, that's kind of good enough. When you get to the areas of complex corporate law like insolvency, unfortunately that creates a lot of problems down the track. So I think what we do need, we've been calling on the government to do this for some time, is a root and branch review of our insolvency laws to make them simpler, to encourage better opportunities to turn around businesses in Australia. But of course, to making them simpler, that means that they're more approachable for businesses and they're more useful. So we do hope that once we get through this pandemic, that the Australian Law Reform Commission or somebody else can lead a proper review that's going to help all businesses into the future have a better and safer environment to get through any type of financial distress.
John, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Great to catch up again, Sean. Thank you.
That was John Winter, Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Restructuring, Insolvency and Turnaround Association, otherwise known as ARETA.